I did not release the mongoose to gamble with nature. I did it because no child in Burkina Faso should die walking to school. Some call it reckless. I call it responsibility.
In the heart of Africa, in the sun-baked soil of rural Burkina Faso, fear was not a rumor, it was routine. Every morning, families said silent prayers as their children left for school, hoping they would return home safely. Not because of war, not because of famine, but because of snakes. The Habu Pit Viper, a venomous serpent that had infested the countryside, was killing hundreds every year. Its bite wasn't just fatal, it was cruel. Victims suffered unbearable swelling, nausea, organ failure, and in remote areas with no access to electricity or antivenom refrigeration, death was often just hours away. The government tried everything. Education limited distribution of antidotes, but nothing worked. The vipers kept coming. And then, President Ibrahim Traoré did something no one saw coming. He ordered the release of over 300 mongooses, nature's sworn enemy of the snake. It was bold. It was unconventional. Some called it madness, but others, especially those living in fear, called it hope. So we ask you now, do you believe in fighting nature with nature, or are we sometimes blinded by desperation? Subscribe if you believe real leadership means taking action, even when the outcome is uncertain. In today's story, we'll explore the rise and fall of one of Africa's most unusual environmental experiments, and what it reveals about power risk and unintended consequences in the age of Africa news. Long before the world began whispering the name Ibrahim Traoré, before headlines in Africa, news highlighted Burkina Faso's defiance and resilience. There was a quiet horror unfolding in the countryside. Rural communities, isolated, impoverished, but proud, were fighting a losing battle against an invisible killer. This was not a war of guns, nor a struggle of politics. It was a war of survival against a predator that slithered in the grass. The Habu Pit Viper, a deadly serpent native to certain West African terrains, had become an unstoppable force in Burkina Faso's agricultural zones. With fangs long enough to pierce through boots and venom potent enough to destroy blood cells within minutes, this snake was no ordinary reptile. It was an executioner. Year after year, reports flowed in. Children bitten while walking to school, farmers collapsing in the fields, mothers sobbing over lifeless bodies that never made it to a clinic. Some villages recorded over 40 deaths annually. The nation's antivenom reserves were sparse and fragile, relying on cold chain storage that didn't exist in many areas. Without electricity, even saving a single life became a logistical miracle. When President Ibrahim Traoré took office, he inherited this problem not from his predecessor, but from nature itself. And unlike many who chose silence or slow bureaucracy, Traoré moved swiftly. He believed that real leadership meant engaging with the pain of his people, even when the solutions weren't obvious. Let's stop admiring the problem, he reportedly told his health minister during a closed-door briefing. Let's solve it. But traditional methods failed. Importing high-grade antivenom was too costly. Establishing rural emergency centers would take years, and with every passing week, more funerals were held in mud-walled homes across Burkina Faso. Then came an idea so unconventional, it bordered on the mythical. Somewhere in a dusty briefing room, an ecological advisor brought up the mongoose, a fast, fearless predator known to attack and kill venomous snakes. In parts of India, the mongoose was legendary. Could it work here? Could nature balance nature? The science was promising. The mongoose is immune to snake venom due to a unique acetylcholine receptor that blocks neurotoxic effects. Its agility, speed, and bite force made it the perfect snake hunter. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't just entertain the proposal, he owned it. In a nationally televised address carried by Africa News, he said, "If the West cannot help us, we will help ourselves. If medicine fails, we turn to nature. And if our children are dying, I will try anything to save them." It was both inspiring and controversial. A team of wildlife biologists worked around the clock to source and acclimate the animals. Within 60 days, 300 mongooses bred and conditioned in a controlled environment were released into 5 snake-infested zones across the country. The public reaction was divided. Many cheered Traoré's courage. Rural citizens held rallies with signs that read, "Our leader protects us, even from the ground." For the first time in months, optimism returned. Burkina Faso was making news not for conflict or coups, but for innovation. Africa News ran with the headline, "President Traoré turns to nature in battle against death." International observers watched in awe, some with admiration, others with skepticism. At first, there were signs of success. Local farmers began spotting fewer vipers. Children returned to schools with less fear. A grandmother in the village of Tangin recounted seeing a mongoose battle a viper in her backyard, and winning. But as any ecologist will tell you, nature is not a switch. It is a web, and pulling one thread can rattle the entire structure. And yet, in those early months, the sense of hope was undeniable. Burkina Faso was not waiting for handouts. Under the steady hand of Ibrahim Traoré, the country was writing its own playbook, one that was grounded in dignity action and a refusal to accept helplessness. More than a biological experiment, the mongoose release became a symbol, a statement, one that said, "We may be small, we may be poor, but we will never accept death in silence." Even those who disagreed with the tactic could not ignore the moral clarity with which it was pursued. Every decision, every risk, every press statement bore the unmistakable imprint of a leader who truly walked among his people. And in that moment, Burkina Faso was not just a nation in West Africa. It was a case study in courage, innovation, and the brutal complexities of trying to outsmart nature itself. For a brief moment, the air in Burkina Faso felt lighter. It was as if the mongoose had not only hunted snakes, but had devoured fear itself. Villages once paralyzed by dusk were now alive at night. Children played outside longer. Farmers ventured deeper into their fields. In radio interviews across rural provinces, people credited the mongoose operation with restoring a sense of normalcy. And yet, just beneath the surface, something darker was stirring. President Ibrahim Traoré, confident in the strategy's early promise, called it a victory of nature over terror. Africa News continued praising the effort, publishing op-eds hailing the move as Afro-ecological sovereignty in action. But within 6 months, the cracks began to show. The first reports came from environmental researchers near the forest regions of Tandougou. The mongoose, they noted, were not merely snake killers. With no natural predators of their own and plenty of daylight freedom, they had begun expanding their diet. Birds, lizards, small mammals. And most concerning of all, the indigenous long-eared desert rabbit, a native species found only in this part of Burkina Faso. Locals called it the ancestors' rabbit, a spiritual creature, a symbol of fertility and resilience. And now, a prey item. Soon, entire patches of bushland, once teeming with life, fell silent. The mongooses, highly territorial and fast reproducing, began competing with each other, forming roaming packs. Where once they hunted snakes, they now attacked burrows' nests and anything that moved. The ecological balance was rupturing. Conservationists sounded the alarm. "We didn't just introduce a predator," one biologist explained on state radio. "We introduced an ecosystem disruptor." But for many citizens, especially those still haunted by the trauma of snakebite deaths, these warnings sounded elitist. "We buried children," one woman shouted during a town hall in Koudougou. "Now you're worried about rabbits." The country became divided, not just between rural and urban, but between emotion and evidence. And while the vipers remained dangerous, field surveys showed their population hadn't declined significantly. The reason: a critical miscalculation. The Habu Pit Viper is nocturnal. It slithers under moonlight strikes in silence and hides during the day. The mongoose, by contrast, is diurnal active in sunlight, the overlap minimal. This meant direct mongoose-viper confrontations were far rarer than expected, and the ones that did occur, not always victorious. Several reports confirmed injuries and deaths of mongoose groups caught off guard by more aggressive snakes. The perfect predator image was cracking. Inside the presidential palace, President Ibrahim Traoré called for a classified review. His closest advisors, including biologists, military officers, and rural affairs officials, gathered for a tense debrief. This wasn't failure, Traoré said, calm but firm. This was an experiment, and like all experiments, we must accept unexpected results. But outside the walls of leadership, the narrative was spiraling. Africa News, once the champion of the campaign, began publishing a new wave of coverage. From savior to scourge, one headline questioned. International media soon followed. The BBC ran a segment titled, "The Mongoose Mistake What Went Wrong in Burkina Faso." The New York Times called it a cautionary tale in populist environmental policy. Still, Traoré did not back down. He gave a national address this time, less celebratory, more reflective. We acted because death was near. We acted because our children deserved protection. And now, if that action brings new challenges, we will face them with the same courage. The speech struck a chord. It wasn't about pride, it was about responsibility. But even as he spoke, the damage deepened. In the eastern highlands, livestock losses rose. Mongooses had begun raiding poultry coops. Small-scale farmers, once the loudest supporters, now demanded answers. One old man in Sicily, tears in his eyes, told a local reporter, "First the snakes killed my daughter. Then the mongoose killed my goats. I am too tired to praise or blame." In ecology, every solution is also a new question, and Burkina Faso was learning that truth in real time. The nation had tried to fight nature with nature, and discovered that nature does not negotiate. Still, through the noise, one figure remained steady. Ibrahim Traoré. He did not fire staff. He did not deny the fallout. Instead, he convened open forums, invited independent environmentalists, expanded research funding, and most tellingly ordered a humane population control program for the mongoose, respecting the life he had once deployed. When asked by Africa News if he regretted the operation, he said, "I regret that nature makes no promises, but I do not regret trying to protect my people." That sentence, measured honest and heavy, echoed through community radios across the country. Because even in error, leadership is not about being right, it's about being accountable. The mongoose experiment didn't end with disappointment. It evolved into a national reckoning. Across Burkina Faso, the consequences were not just environmental. They were deeply political and deeply human. In the months that followed the ecological shift, rural livelihoods were disrupted on a scale few had predicted. Small game animals vanished, upsetting local food chains. Bird populations dropped in migratory zones. The once abundant long-eared rabbit, critical to both biodiversity and cultural symbolism, neared extinction in certain regions. A silent devastation settled over the country, not as loud as the snake bites, but no less painful. By late spring, farmers began voicing frustration in organized ways. Town halls turned into tense exchanges. In the market city of Kaya, a coalition of agricultural cooperatives submitted an open letter to the government, demanding immediate assessment of secondary ecological damages. Their words were respectful, but clear. "We do not blame our president for trying to save us. We blame the silence that followed when things began to fall apart." This wasn't rebellion. It was a plea for acknowledgement, a plea for healing. President Ibrahim Traoré, to his credit, did not retreat into the comforts of power. He traveled to affected regions sometimes without cameras, walking fields with elders, listening to their pain. "Tell me everything," he told one group of women farmers. "Tell me what I missed." They did. And he listened. Meanwhile, opposition parties, some of which had remained dormant since Traoré's anti-corruption campaigns, saw an opportunity. They began using the mongoose crisis as political ammunition. One headline in Africa news read, "Snake panic turns to political poison." At rallies, critics claimed the president had experimented with the countryside like a child with a chemistry set. But the reality was far more complicated. Behind closed doors, government ministries scrambled to contain the fallout. The Ministry of Environment deployed rapid biodiversity teams to assess population collapses. The Ministry of Agriculture restructured livestock insurance programs after reports of mongoose attacking hens and small goats. Perhaps most notably, President Ibrahim Traoré signed off on the creation of the Burkina Ecological Response Council, an interministerial task force with oversight from independent environmental groups. Its mandate was threefold: to evaluate the real extent of damage, to recommend science-based solutions for rebalancing local ecosystems, to propose long-term safeguards before any future biointervention projects. It was a monumental shift, a leader admitting that not all solutions work out as intended, and that the dignity of repair matters just as much as the boldness of action. But healing wasn't just about wildlife. In the remote district of Nauna, an unexpected phenomenon emerged. A new kind of rural migration. Families frustrated by mongoose interference with crops and livestock began moving closer to urban centers. These weren't people fleeing war, they were fleeing imbalance. Their villages weren't uninhabitable, but they were unpredictable. One family told a Burkina Faso radio station, first it was snakes. Now it's predators we didn't choose. We just want to sleep at night. Urban migration, however, strained infrastructure. Schools in Bobo Dioulasso became overcrowded. Food prices rose in Ouagadougou due to rural supply disruption. What had begun as a rural ecological plan was now reshaping the nation's urban development map. Through it all, Ibrahim Traoré remained present. At a televised policy review summit, he addressed the issue head-on. "We have made mistakes, but let no one say we did nothing while our children died. Let no one say we stood still while our villages buried their young." That honesty resonated more than any spin. In international forums, pundits drew parallels with other failed wildlife interventions around the world. But in Burkina Faso, the public saw something deeper. They saw a man who dared to act and dared to admit when the cost was higher than expected. In fact, several regional governments, Mali, Niger, and even Senegal, requested ecological consultation from Burkina Faso's newly formed environmental task force. "We may not have solved everything," said one Burkinabe researcher to Africa News, "but we're learning faster than anyone else in West Africa." International observers were struck by the transparency. In many nations, failed ecological policies are buried under paperwork and denial. But here in a land once dismissed by the world, an uncomfortable truth was being documented, studied, and taught. And that perhaps was the greatest legacy of the mongoose experiment, not the outcome, but the maturity it revealed. Burkina Faso did not cover its scars, it showed them. Across the Atlantic, the mongoose story reached American living rooms in snippets, sensational, often misunderstood, and occasionally unfairly mocked. Late-night talk shows made casual jokes about Burkina's feral rodent army, while major outlets ran headlines ranging from "Nature's experiment gone wild" to "African president deploys predators in snake war." But beneath the punchlines, a quieter, more thoughtful conversation began to emerge. On NPR's All Things Considered, a guest ecologist from UC Davis explained the underlying science of the decision and its risks. "It's easy to laugh from afar," she said, "but let's be honest. If venomous snakes were killing hundreds of people a year in rural Texas, Americans would demand action yesterday. What Traore did was desperate, yes, but also deeply human. The New York Times eventually published a more nuanced piece between the snake and the soil, Burkina Faso's bold gamble. It explored not just the biological side of the decision, but the emotional calculus of leadership, what it means to act in the absence of perfect solutions. American seniors, particularly veterans, farmers, and immigrants, found resonance in the story. To them, this wasn't about wildlife. It was about dignity, about a leader who looked death in the face and refused to accept it quietly. One Vietnam War veteran from Alabama wrote a letter to a local newspaper saying, "I may not know much about African snakes, but I know what it feels like to be told to wait for help that never comes." That man Traore, he acted. I respect that. From a geopolitical angle, some think tanks use the crisis to question Africa's readiness for autonomous environmental policy. A Heritage Foundation report called the Mongoose Plan a reflection of unregulated populism. Others, however, praised Ibrahim Traoré as a case study in moral leadership under pressure. A Brookings Institute fellow noted, "The mistake wasn't deploying the mongoose. The mistake was thinking that leadership means having all the answers. What Traoré shows is that leadership can also mean admitting when you were wrong and fixing it." Meanwhile, international environmental organizations took a more technical stance. The World Wildlife Fund offered support to Burkina Faso's new Ecological Response Council. The African Union initiated a summit on nature-based interventions and their risks, using Burkina Faso as a case study. Back in the U.S., grassroots solidarity also grew. Social media pages like New Africa Rising and Black Conscious Voices praised the president's courage. Hashtags like Stand with Traore and Africa Owns Its Solutions trended briefly. People began to ask larger questions. Why is it that when the West experiments, it's called innovation, but when Africa tries, it's called a mistake? Africa News ran a powerful editorial addressing that very double standard. If a European leader had released drones to fight pests, we would call it cutting edge. If America releases wolves into Yellowstone, it's called restoration. But when President Traoré releases mongoose to protect children, he is laughed at. No. We must demand consistency and respect, and that, in the end, was the global lesson. Burkina Faso, through the pain and controversy, had done something few nations dared. It tried. It failed. It learned. And it kept walking forward. The world watched and slowly began to listen. In the end, the mongoose didn't just hunt snakes. It hunted assumptions about leadership, about Africa, about how far one man will go when his people cry for help. President Ibrahim Traoré may not have tamed nature, but he revealed something far more enduring, the cost of courage. He stood before the world, not with excuses, but with the raw truth of responsibility. Few leaders do that anymore. Burkina Faso, through this trial, became more than just a country in West Africa. It became a mirror for all of us, reflecting what happens when human desperation meets ecological uncertainty. In America, where we debate solutions in air-conditioned rooms, we must ask ourselves, what would we do if our children died walking to school? Would we wait for studies, or would we act? And so I leave you with two questions. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective? Yet can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré, or should we support someone else to succeed him? If you believe stories like these deserve a place in the public conversation, not just as headlines, but as human struggles with real stakes, then let's keep them alive. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Because Africa News is not just what the world tells you, It's what Africa lives through, rises from, and fights for every single day. And in Burkina Faso, that fight continues.